Story 1. This story primarily takes place between me and my annoying neighbor who is a member of my community's HOA. As a bit of background, me and my 3 roommates moved into a housing community that is basically just a bunch of cookie-cutter townhomes. All of these homes have garages that open onto streets that wind through the community. This is important later with your front door opening to a path on the other side of your house. There are also some free parking spots on the edge of the community where there are no houses. When we first moved in, we quickly found out that parking could be a bit of a pain during the day, especially when people had guests during the weekend. Now my roommates and I admittedly have more cars than the average family. Because we usually have to commute for work, we each have one. We try to make parking easier by using the garage, but we all have tons of sporting equipment, so we can usually only get one car in the garage. When all the parking in all the free spots is full, we just park our cars right up against the garage and leave them there during the day or overnight. We'd seen other neighbors do it, and it still left ample room for people driving on the street to get by. Well, one day, my annoying neighbor comes up while my roommates and I are in the garage organizing some stuff and tells us that we can't park there overnight as it's against community rules. Before we had a chance to respond, he added, "And if you do it again, I will personally make sure you're towed." His first comment was pretty reasonable. We'd just moved in and didn't know that rule. But his second comment really just made him sound like a jerk and wasn't necessary. One of my roommates simply responded that we didn't know as we'd just moved in and we wouldn't park there overnight anymore. Well, my neighbor, clearly trying to assert his dominance, responded with, "Good. You better not, because I'll be watching." Well, from then on, we did follow those rules. If we parked in front of our garage during the day, we would make sure to move before we went to sleep. This worked out for a while until one fateful day. One of my roommates stopped by quickly after work to grab some dinner and clothes before heading out. This was around 7 p.m., so he just parked up against the garage, as it would be quicker than the parking spaces. Plus, it was early enough that he didn't think he'd get towed. Around 8 p.m., he went to head out and his car was gone. Guess who was there, though? Our annoying neighbor standing right outside. Immediately, he said to my roommates, "Told you you were going to get towed if you parked here again." The neighbor and my roommate argued for a bit before my roommate came back inside and called the car lot. Well, he ends up finding it closed, so he'll have to get his car in the morning. The kicker? They're going to charge him an overnight fee. All in all, it comes out to $500, which isn't a small amount of money for us. This neighbor has been a jerk to us since we moved in, and even though it wasn't my car that was towed, I took this personally. To make sure we didn't get towed again, we decided to read the community rules, and lo and behold, we found out that the street in front of the garage is actually considered a fire lane, and no one is supposed to park there at any point during the day. Between the annoying neighbor treating us badly and the fact that we could get him yelling at his wife every night, not a big detail to the story, but just wanted to add to my point that this guy just sucked, I started to plan my revenge. Since quarantine started, I've been able to work from home, and my desk conveniently looks out onto the street between the houses. This means that I can clearly see our neighbor's garage. I start to take notice of when he parks his car out in front of his garage. For about 2 weeks, I noticed that he would come home around 1 p.m. and leave again at 2 p.m. On the 3rd week, I decided I would begin the revenge. On Monday, true to his schedule, he stopped by around 1. After about 10 minutes, I gave the tow company a call and said that he was parked in the fire lane and if they could come and remove his car. 20 minutes later, a tow truck rolled up, hooked his car up, and towed it off. About 15 minutes later, our neighbor came out, and I could hear him start to yell back into his house, presumably at his wife. He then left and didn't come back until later that evening after he'd gotten his car. Now, it was funny to do this, and I made sure to send snaps to my roommates who don't work from home, but I wasn't done yet. See, this jerk apparently didn't learn the first time, because literally the next day he parks in front of his garage again. What should I do? Well, the exact same thing as the day before, of course. Again, he comes out, realizes his car is gone, yells at his wife, and then goes to get it. Now, after this time, he is a bit smarter and parks in an actual spot before going in to get his lunch or whatever it is he does there midday. He does this for about 2 weeks before he decides that it's okay to park in front of his garage again. Well, who is still sitting at their desk every day and notices this immediately? Well, me, of course. And being the concerned resident that I am, I immediately call the tow company and off his car goes again. And again, this is met with yelling. After this third time, I decided I would stop because I genuinely felt bad for his wife, who he seemed to do most of the yelling at, as if it was her fault that he was stupid. What I can tell you is that it definitely cost him over $1K. If he hadn't gotten my roommate's car towed, then we wouldn't have ever found that fun little rule. The best part was that a number of my neighbors would have their cars parked there at the same time, and they'd never have their cars towed, which made it all the better when his was. Story 2. Having received positive feedback on my previous revenge story, thanks, Mom, I'm excited to share a few more from my 16-year career as a carpenter and project manager. This particular incident took place around 3 years ago. After closing down my framing company, I decided to pursue a job as a site supervisor for a development I had been involved in. When transitioning to the builder's team, I managed to secure job positions for 3 out of my 4 employees, ensuring their job security and avoiding any negative impact on them. The 4th individual, however, was a difficult person to work with. Despite his excellent work ethic, he had a terrible attitude, undesirable habits, and was generally disliked by the rest of the crew. I reluctantly kept him on solely because he generated profits for me. My apologies for that. The first couple of months in my new role went smoothly. My 3 former employees adjusted to their expanded responsibilities beyond framing, although they weren't particularly thrilled about certain tasks. Let's face it, who enjoys working in muddy holes or engaging in physically demanding labor? As expected, my crew always ended up dirty, wearing work clothes to the site, including myself. After all, no one wants to ruin a nice pair of jeans or a clean white t-shirt by staining or tearing them. Admittedly, our professional appearance left something to be desired. However, after some time, the owner felt that our crew's appearance needed improvement. Personally, I believed that actions spoke louder than appearances, and I had always embraced the notion that sometimes you need to break an egg to make an omelet. Nonetheless, considering the owner's perspective, I understood the need for change. Since working with the builder, I had managed to save them $9 per square foot per house, and the owner seemed pleased with those cost savings. Under my guidance, the quality of work from the other trades had improved without incurring additional expenses, resulting in our houses looking superior to our competitors during the construction phase. One day, halfway through the week, I was called into a meeting with the owner. He expressed his dissatisfaction with our crew's appearance, suggesting that our work attire should reflect the quality of homes we were building. To address this, he provided us with uniforms enough for everyone to have a set to wear each day, with an extra set for those working on Saturdays. The uniforms were even embroidered with our names, which was a nice touch. I responded enthusiastically, saying, "Hey boss man, that's a fantastic idea. It will make my guys feel more included and happier. You've even personalized the uniforms with their names. That's really cool." My crew was overjoyed. They received new shirts, pants, steel-toed boots, steel-toed cold weather rubber boots, jacket, hard hats, high-visibility vests, and more. All of it was top-notch, name brand gear supplied by the company. It felt like Christmas had come early. That is, until they received their paychecks. To their shock and dismay, each person, including myself, was docked $1,357 for the cost of the uniforms. Even my lowest-paid employee, who earned $15 per hour, ended up owing money to the company. The next person's paycheck showed a deduction of $3.16, while the highest-paid employee had a staggering $1.57 deducted. As for me, my paycheck was reduced by over $2,500. I realized that I had made more money working as a builder for the owner than I did managing his site. I was livid. And this is where my desire for revenge started to take shape. After compensating my employees for their deducted wages, I decided to dig deeper into the matter. Much to my satisfaction, I discovered that in my jurisdiction, if an employer requires their employees to wear a specific uniform, they are legally obligated to provide it free of charge. Meanwhile, during this time, I had been utilizing my personal accounts at suppliers for miscellaneous items. Armed with this knowledge, I called for a meeting, printed out the relevant sections of the Labor Standards Act, and highlighted the crucial points. I explained to my boss that their actions were not only illegal, but had also put my guys in jeopardy of losing their homes. If I hadn't stepped up, they would have faced eviction, unpaid child support, and even worse consequences. My boss took it all in and dismissively responded, "It's not mandatory. That's why you guys have to cover the cost." Remaining calm, I replied, "All right, boss man. Since my guys can't afford to spend $1,357 on work clothes, I'll have everything returned. Most of it is still brand new, so you can return the unused items, and I'll pay the difference." We all returned to work, wearing our torn jeans, ripped shirts, and stained jackets, as if nothing had changed. Problem solved, right? Not quite. 2 days later, I was fired. And since my crew was seen as my guys, they were let go as well. Instead of immediately sharing the news with my team, I instructed them to gather all the tools I had purchased and anything else I had paid for. I told them to take Friday off, assuring them that I would explain everything over the weekend. The following Monday, I resumed my carpentry work, this time for a competing builder. But the story doesn't end there. I filed a complaint with the labor standards authorities and placed a builder's lien on the 15 properties I had been managing, seeking payment for the outstanding expenses. I patiently waited for a response. When my former boss continued to ignore any claims against him, I escalated the situation by placing a lien on his personal home. I had completed $25,000 worth of work on his house, with payment intended upon its sale, plus an additional 10% for the delay. This action caught his attention, especially since his house was already sold, pending the buyer's own property closing. The lien effectively prevented him from selling the property without settling his debt to me first. Ignoring all calls except those from his lawyer, I essentially brought his business to a halt, and he attempted to shift the blame onto me. To cut a long story short, I eventually received the $56,000 he owed me in total. Suffice it to say, that guy got what he deserved. Story 3. So this happened to me a few years ago, and I just wanted to share it here, and it is a long one. Senior year of high school, I was taking a plane to visit my grandma. The flight went from Baltimore to Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh to Vegas, then Vegas to Boise. The flight from Baltimore was almost empty, and I was Southwest so I could choose my own seat, and I was on the same plane until Vegas. I selected the last row of the plane by the window, put my earbuds in, and took a nap till Pittsburgh. When the plane landed, I went to the bathroom while people were getting onto the plane. To save my spot, I left my backpack in my seat and put my jacket on the seat and left. When I got back, I noticed that this pregnant lady sitting in my seat and her husband sitting in the aisle seat, with my jacket thrown on the ground in the aisle with my backpack underneath with a laptop in it. I got really annoyed. I pointed out that I was previously sitting in the window seat, and I wanted to know if I could have my seat back. "Can't you see that I am pregnant and need this seat?" she said aggressively. I then looked at the husband and asked if he could please scoot over and sit next to his wife. This guy looked me in the eyes and said, "Sorry, but we are allowed to choose our own seats, and I chose the aisle seat." Being a high school senior, I wasn't that big of a guy, but I was still not happy to be sitting in the center seat. Realizing that this was a losing argument and I wasn't going to get any leverage over this lady, I decided to grit my teeth and bear it, collect my stuff, and move into the middle seat. The second I sat down, the lady said, "You can't have your backpack in your seat. You're going to have to find a place to put it." "I'm just going to put it under my seat." "Where am I going to put my feet then?" "I don't know. Not under my seat?" I said sarcastically. Suddenly, I felt someone grab my collar. The husband pulled me inches from his face and said, "Don't talk to my wife or the baby like that. You will say you're sorry." I was shocked. Not only was this guy grabbing me in public, but at the time I was only 17 and still considered a minor. But not wanting to make a deal out of this, I gave the most insincere "I'm sorry" to the woman and put my earbuds in as the flight was getting ready to take off. While taxiing, the lady kept trying to get my attention by yelling in my ear and snapping her fingers inches in front of my face, before she finally pulled my earbuds out. "You need to turn your electronics off during takeoff," she said. Now, my dad was a pilot for 30 years, and he confirmed that electronics don't interfere with communications. It is mostly a formality so that people pay attention to the emergency instructions. So I ignore her, since we are literally less than a minute from taking off. In rage, she spams the flight attendant button, so that one comes we also had to hold takeoff until this issue was solved. The flight attendant runs over and asks what is wrong, expecting an emergency. "He won't turn off his electronics before flight. He is trying to kill us," she exclaims. Realizing everyone is staring at us, when the flight attendant asks me to turn it off, I oblige. After I turn it off, she starts to lecture me about how she was right and I was wrong, rubbing how the flight attendant proved her right. So the flight is in the air, and when the intercom tells me we can use electronics, I put my earbuds in and crank it. About 5 minutes into the flight, I feel aggravated tapping on my shoulder. I turn and look at the woman. "You need to turn that down. It is bad for the baby." While I was listening to the music louder than normal, it still wasn't to the point that an unborn baby would be able to hear and be able to understand. Shocked, I responded with no, but the second she reached for the flight attendant button, I said that I would. I did that trick where you turn your volume down 2 times and then up once so that it looks like you turned it down 3 times. "Better?" I asked. "More," she responded, so I went down 1 more. And before I could put my earbuds in, she said, "It is proper etiquette to talk to people you're sitting next to." But I just ignored her. I sit back and try and close my eyes, and amazingly this worked. I fall asleep for about an hour. It was a 5-hour flight. When I woke up, this woman had her foot on my backpack with a laptop in it. So I adjust my foot so that it would be uncomfortable for her to continue to keep her feet the way they were. She immediately stood up, and I thought she was going to yell given her ability to overreact. But it turns out she was just getting up to go to the bathroom. She gets past me and her husband when a brilliant idea pops into my head. The second she steps into the bathroom, I get ready to get up and move my stuff over to the window seat. And as I grab my backpack and shift my momentum over, I feel a hand grab me. I did not take into account the husband. "You are not taking my wife's seat," he said. "Sir, I have to warn you that you are grabbing a minor, and if I feel like it at any second, I could cry that you are attacking me." I respond as he lets go and I move over to the seat I had before. When she gets back, she is furious, demanding that I move seats, now to the point that the flight attendant comes over to see what is going on. And this time she sides with me when she asks her husband to make me move. I look him dead in the eyes, and he goes back to reading his book, and she sits in the middle seat, looking very angry. Thankfully, I moved seats because she was up and down in her seat, having to go to the bathroom every 15 minutes. And that was pretty much the rest of the flight, except how she intercepted my bag of pretzels when the drink cart came. I responded by closing the shade to the window as we started to land at the Las Vegas airport. Once off the plane, I went to Burger King to get a drink and some food. Then I got to my next gate and found the last seat. I scarfed down my fries and burger, walk across the hall, literally 10 feet from my seat, to throw away my garbage, and when I turned to go back to my seat, I see the same lady now sitting in the seat I had my bag in. She had moved it to the floor right in front of her. Then she shot me this big smug grin, thinking she had won. Somewhat defeated by losing 2 seats to this lady, losing sleep and my patience, it was time for action. I walked over to her to gather my things, and as I got to her, I looked her dead in the eyes, raised my right hand out, fingers spread, and hovered it right over her stomach. Looked down at my hand, then back to her eyes. "I just cursed your baby." I say straight-faced, turn around 180, walk across the hall and sit down on the floor staring at her intensely. Now I don't believe in curses, nor do I think I have the ability to place a curse, but this lady believed it. Her face was left expressionless, and she just started weeping to herself as I sat and watched. When her husband came over to see what was wrong, and she told him, he instantly stormed over to me and knocked the drink out of my hand, grabbed me by the collar, and got right in my face. "Listen here, you little jerk." Security guards immediately came, grabbed the man, and detained him. The FA doesn't mess around with who they hire. One guard asked me why this guy was angry, and I said that his wife had taken my seat, and I made a comment under my breath, and he got upset with me. The officer asked for my name and identification, and saw that I was a minor. He asked if I wanted to press charges, and I told him yes, but that I also didn't want to miss my flight. He understood and let me go, then informed the Southwest airline gate attendant to please keep track of me in case we needed more information. This meant that I got to get on early, and I chose the first seat I could. Aisle seat to see if this lady would get on the plane, since she was sitting in the same gate as my flight. She never got on the plane, and it takes off. Halfway through the flight attendant asked me if I put a curse on the baby, and I responded with, "I don't know magic." 20 minutes later, the flight attendant told me that unfortunately I would not be able to press charges on them due to being a minor, but that they missed their flight and they would have to buy a new ticket to their final destination with another airline. With 5 words, I cost this horrible woman and her abusive husband around $500. Story 4. This happened several years ago when I worked as a construction project manager for a company that serviced retail point-of-sale systems. The job included everything from adding or removing a register to installing all the electronics in a newly constructed store. One year, I decided to take a camping and off-road vacation in a remote area and was supposed to meet some friends. They called me to inform me that they were going to be about 6 hours late. Since I knew some people at the local grocery store where I had recently finished doing the remodeling, I decided to walk over and say hi. When I arrived, I found that half of their front end was down. The manager asked if I could help, and since I was just killing time, I told him I could if my boss approved the overtime. Anyone who worked in the field was paid hourly. The overtime was approved, and it quickly became apparent that the issue was caused by the cleaning contractor dismantling registers the night before to make it easier to clean, which violated their contract. I managed to fix all but 2 lanes, which had damaged power and data cables. I informed the manager that I could fix them with parts from the local hardware store and electronics shop if he would reimburse me. I also asked if I could park my truck in the vendor-only spot, as the parking lot was full and I would need some tools I carried in my truck. He agreed, so I retrieved my truck, picked up the items I needed, and parked in the vendor spot. This detail becomes important later. Both registers required the cabinets to be dismantled in order to replace the damaged cables. I fixed the first lane and got it operational. Then, I moved to the second lane, which was right in front of the customer service desk. I made sure the closed sign was up and used a 6-wheeled cart, loaded with a special order, to block the register. While lying under the register belt to connect the new cables to the register base, someone kicked me. They kicked me again, so I reflexively lashed out with my steel-toed boot and hit a woman in the knee. She dropped to the floor screaming, and briefly lost consciousness after hitting her head on the cart she had moved. What had happened was that she decided my lane should be open. She moved the cart, tossed the closed sign on the floor, and kicked me for ignoring her. What she failed to notice was that there was a local police officer at the customer service desk asking if they wanted the lifted truck in the vendor spot ticketed. The manager was directing him to where I was to see if the truck belonged to me, and they both witnessed the woman kicking me. The police officer called an ambulance for the woman and then asked if I wanted to press charges, which I did. The store also pressed charges, as she had been banned from the store and was violating a no trespass order. She later pled guilty to trespassing and a misdemeanor assault charge after being informed that a police officer had witnessed the attack and that it had been recorded on security cameras. My employer's legal team informed me that I was being subpoenaed for a deposition because she was suing both companies for compensation, claiming that I had broken her kneecap and given her a concussion. However, a week later, I was told that the deposition was canceled because the judge had dismissed the case with prejudice, citing the police report, which confirmed that she had initiated the violence. Story 5. I used to work as a driver for a freight company that handled awkwardly sized items no other couriers would touch. We delivered everything from coffins to tractor parts and also had to collect items from our customers for delivery the next day. This company employed a mix of contractors and permanent drivers. I was a relief driver, familiar with most routes, so I covered for others during holidays or sickness. The depot was managed by 2 people, a delivery manager and a collection manager. These 2 didn't see eye to eye because sometimes getting items delivered conflicted with collecting them, and their targets reflected failures in a negative way. One particular day, I had to cover a contractor's route that I wasn't familiar with. Loading our trucks took a little longer than usual, and I had around 45 deliveries that day, which was a high number for this predominantly rural route. I asked my manager, the delivery manager, if he knew the route. He said he did and organized my route for me, so I was set to go, although I was running a bit late. I mentioned that with the volume I had, I might struggle and asked him to keep an eye out for me. He agreed. Around midday, I realized I wouldn't be able to complete all the deliveries, and the collections wouldn't get done either. I also noticed that one of the collections was off route, and the contractor had a vehicle in that area anyway. I called my delivery manager and told him he had to choose between collections or deliveries. I also asked why the contractor couldn't cover the off-route collection. He told me to call back later, and he'd see if he could sort something out. He also insisted that the off-route collection would have to be done as well. When I called back later and asked for help again, he said no help was available. So, I gave him the option of choosing between deliveries or collections since there wasn't enough time to do both. He firmly said both had to be done. Later, the delivery manager went home, so I called in again and got the collection manager. She reiterated that no help was available, meaning either the deliveries or collections would fail. If that happened, I'd be called into the office the next day. Cue some calculated compliance. I visited one of the collection points and asked what time they closed. They said 6:30 p.m., so I told them I'd be back later. I continued with the deliveries, which took me further away from that collection point. At the appropriate time, I stopped delivering and drove to the collection. I collected 2 small parcels, and that was all. I then drove back to where I had stopped and continued delivering. This cost me about an hour. I finished my last delivery at 7:15 p.m., with a 45-minute drive back to my yard ahead of me. As I was leaving the area, I got a frantic call from the collection manager. She wanted to know where I was. I explained what had happened and reminded her that I had asked for help 4 times, but was told I had to complete everything assigned to me, so I did. It wasn't my fault that it turned out this way. Here's where the real trouble started. The company's transportation system relied on trucks leaving the depot at a specific time. For our depot, the cutoff time was 7:30 p.m. I wheeled in just after 8 p.m. There were 15 upset guys on overtime waiting for me to arrive, along with an articulated truck waiting for those 2 parcels. This delay caused the entire transportation system to run late the next day. When I got back, my routing was questioned, as it was considered questionable at best. I informed the collection manager that the delivery manager had organized it. This led to angry emails between the delivery and collection managers, and I imagine the logistics team also demanded an explanation. It was clear that people were held accountable. The next day, no one said a word. I wasn't assigned to that route, and going forward, at least for a while, they either helped when I asked or didn't assign me as much work. Additionally, since I had exceeded legal driving time, they had to make sure I went home early for a few days, so there was a bit of a win for me there. The biggest issue these managers faced was their assumption that drivers were always trying to have an easy day. Even when presented with evidence, they still believed we were trying to be clever. This time, their assumptions backfired on them badly. Story 6. I 38M have been married to Mike 35M for 3 years, and we've been together for 12 years. We are quiet, nerdy, nature-loving guys who aren't into flashy displays or drama at all. It was the tail end of the pandemic, and since the borders were partially open, we decided to road trip to Gibraltar and elope. The pandemic was a great excuse not to invite anyone to our wedding and just do what we wanted. When we told our friends D45F and Ann60F about our plans, they immediately decided that we were going to have a double wedding and started suggesting a bunch of expensive things we didn't want. This is the story of how they tried to ruin our wedding, but only managed to ruin theirs. Initially, we planned to rent a car together and split the cost 4 ways, with Mike and Dee sharing the driving. A month before the wedding, Dee and Ann decided it would be cheaper to take the train, actually, 6 trains across 3 countries. I immediately said no, and it turned out Dee didn't even have her driver's license and had been driving illegally for years. Mike offered to do all the driving if they split the rental car with us. They declined, saying it was too expensive, and took the train instead. Unsurprisingly, their trip went terribly. Trains were canceled, tickets were lost, and they missed an entire night in Gibraltar because they were stuck at a random train station in the Spanish countryside. Mike and I had a wonderful road trip and spent a magical night in an Airbnb in Cartagena along the way. Their train tickets ended up costing more than half of the rental car. We initially agreed to get a really fancy Airbnb in Gibraltar with a hot tub and all the amenities. Split 4 ways, we could have gotten something really nice. However, Ann decided she wanted a real hotel and backed out of the Airbnb plan. I found a gorgeous little 1-bedroom place for us, complete with a hot tub and a view of the sea. Dee and Ann forgot to book a hotel and ended up in a terrible place by the port, a spot where merchant sailors stay while they're in port. It was on a busy roundabout opposite a fast food restaurant, with no bath, no balcony, and basic facilities. It was more expensive than our lovely place. They got no sleep because of the drunk sailors and traffic noise, and they didn't even have towels provided. The night before the wedding, we met for dinner. Dee and Ann had barely been in Gibraltar for 2 hours, while we had been relaxing since the day before. At dinner, things were tense, but Dee was really trying. At some point, she signaled to the restaurant host, who came over with a super fancy bucket with champagne on ice. The host popped the cork and gave it to Dee, who handed it to Ann, saying, "Just like the one I gave you in New York, baby." It was clearly supposed to be a romantic moment. Ann refused the cork, and we all smiled nervously to try and smooth things over. The host poured 2 glasses of champagne and handed them to Dee and Ann. Ann took a sip and immediately spat it out, loudly declaring, "It's corked." We all tried the champagne and told her it was delicious. Mike and I don't really drink, but we know what champagne tastes like. Ann insisted the champagne was corked and loudly announced they wouldn't pay for it. The host was upset, and I understood why when she told us it was a £750 bottle. Dee reluctantly paid for it, and Ann sulked for the rest of the night. I was so embarrassed, and our whole evening was ruined. When we got back to our Airbnb, where we took a bubble bath and ate Jaffa cakes, I told Mike that I wasn't going to let them ruin another minute of our trip. If they wanted to ruin theirs, that was their problem. The actual weddings went off okay, apart from the fact that Dee and Ann were still drunk from the night before. The registry office was nice, and I married the man of my dreams. Afterward, we bought them brunch to help them sober up and walked them around the park, taking lovely photos of them. Dee had her finger over the lens in every picture she took of us. When we were done, they suggested we all go to the pub and get drunk. We dropped them off at the pub and went our separate ways. I was honest and told them, I want to be alone with my husband. They couldn't argue with that. For the wedding dinner, Mike, Disa, and I all had fairly casual preferences for a restaurant, but Ann insisted on a fine dining fish restaurant that didn't even serve dessert. I outright refused. I don't eat fish at all, and Ann kept insisting on the fish restaurant, so we decided not to meet up. Anne also tried to convince us to chip and pound 200 for a custom wedding cake to be delivered to the restaurant, but we said no way. Mike and I went to the best steakhouse in Gibraltar, where I had a 1.2 kilogram steak and an amazing cheesecake for dessert. We had a lovely time, and the waitstaff went out of their way to spoil us. Around 8 p.m., they messaged us. "Where are you?" We ignored the message. As it turned out, Anne forgot to make reservations, and the fish restaurant was fully booked. They couldn't leave and go somewhere else because they had to wait for the cake to be delivered. They ended up taking the cake back to their terrible hotel and eating it with their credit cards because they didn't even have cutlery or plates in their room. They got drunk that night on cheap vodka from the supermarket. Mike and I had the perfect evening. We took a taxi home, relaxed on our balcony, watched the stars, and kissed for hours. The next day, Mike and I set out for a day of hiking in the national park, which is a United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization World Heritage Site. It was the best day ever. Mike got robbed and bitten by a monkey, which was absolutely hilarious. We enjoyed a full English breakfast at the Sky Restaurant and explored St. Michael's Cave. We made unforgettable memories while Dee and Anne fought, decided it was Gibraltar's fault, and spontaneously decided to leave. They booked a beach resort up the coast somewhere in Spain and headed on foot to the train station. The trains were all messed up, and they got stranded somewhere in Spain with all their luggage. It took them 14 hours to reach the resort, where they arrived at 11 p.m., only to check out the next morning. Mike and I spent a few more nights enjoying our honeymoon and then road-tripped home. We stayed in the same little place in Cartagena on the way back, and the host even threw us a surprise party. It was magical. Dee and Anne got stranded again on the way home, lost half their luggage, and caught COVID.